No matter what you look at on a Motorola, you get a bigger, brighter, clearer TV picture automatically.
Honestly, it seems like Motorola Mobility should have died long ago, but it's still here.
Motorola is the company responsible for the first transmission from the moon. The name is now synonymous with communication and especially phones, wowing business people in the 80s with mobile communication and defining the high social status of Razr owners in the 2000s.
One of the assets that Motorola has is this tremendous brand.
Nowadays, Motorola is actually two companies, Motorola Solutions and Motorola Mobility. Solutions, the company that produces first responder radios and 911 dispatch software, has been flourishing recently. Mobility, the company in charge of mobile phones and other consumer-based products, has been struggling.
They are well on their way to profitability, which I think is surprising a ton of people.
The iPhone dominated much of the smartphone competition when it gained a significant market share in the late 2000s, and not even a merger with Google could bring Motorola back to its former glory.
Once the iPhone was launched, it was the beginning of the end for Motorola as we knew it as a consumer brand in the United States.
But Motorola Mobility recently made a strong impression on the tech world with the resurrection of its Razr series in the form of a folding smartphone.
I think the new Razr is exactly what the company needs. It's future forward. It's using some very exotic technologies.
The Razr product is going to be good for them because you can tell already from the amount of headlines it's got before it's even shipping. And even though it's only going to ship in relatively small numbers at a very premium price, it does at least reawaken the brand.
The phone did what numerous previous smartphone models couldn't do for the company. It pulled it out of obscurity.
When you think about smartphones in the United States, you usually think about Apple, Samsung, LG, Google Pixel. We don't really think about Motorola Mobility.
The new Razr could put Motorola Mobility back on top, but it has a long way to go given the fall it took during the smartphone wars. Motorola was founded in 1928.
See me at my best. See me on a Motorola.
In the beginning, the company's focus was radio systems for governments and businesses, and home radios and TVs for consumers. In fact, the first words from the moon were transmitted from Motorola equipment.
It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
And Motorola as an anchor company in Chicago, loads of heritage, the car radios, the first radio on the moon. There's so many milestones that they've gone through.
If you look at a lot of the military communications that happened in World War II and even in Vietnam and Korea, that was all backed by Motorola.
A crowning achievement for the company was the first cellular phone call in 1973.
They are one of the founders of the industry. Ultimately, they're up there with those big titans.
Motorola employee Martin Cooper is credited with inventing the cell phone. The company went on to produce the first commercially available cell phone, the Dynatac.
To this day, we still call it the Zach Morris phone.
And you can use your cellular phone to order me a pizza.
This really bulky handset costs around $4,000, which would be about $10,000 in today's money. And it only had about 30 minutes of battery life or 10 hours of standby, so didn't last all day.
Motorola kept churning out the hits, encouraging people like Ben Woods to keep a collection.
I don't know whether it works for my wife so much. She's a bit dismayed about the fact that the garage is absolutely rammed with cell phones, but hey.
By 2004, phones got smaller, more people started buying them, and Motorola was at the top of the mobile phone game, second only to Nokia.
So before the iPhone, there was another phone that everybody had, and that was the Motorola Razr V3. Came out in 2004, and it was a huge success for Motorola. They sold 130 million units.
My favorite phone was the Razr in the 2005 era, and what I loved about it is it was so small, and when you opened it up, you flicked it open, everybody would look at it like, oh my gosh, I can't believe that.
The Razr quickly became a social status symbol and pushed Motorola to the first place phone seller in North America.
Yeah, they changed the game really. They took mobile phones from being functional to fashionable.
But with the coming of the smartphone era, Motorola started losing its grip, mostly because of Apple's iPhone.
Nobody ever thought Apple was going to come on and steal any of their market share or really make a dent at all. But then in 2007, Apple launched the iPhone, and it was a surprise hit.
Motorola's delayed response to the smartphone boom crippled its competitive edge. The Droid was released 2 years after the launch of the first iPhone.
If you missed one product cycle in smartphones, you have been disrupted. You can't miss a beat.
They worked with Verizon in the US to deliver the Droid products because AT&T had got the exclusive with the iPhone. And that was kind of a last hooray for Motorola.
Even though Droid saw success for Motorola and Verizon, sales couldn't keep up with the iPhone. Apple had already asserted its dominance and squashed the competition. In April of 2010, Apple already had 53% of North America's smartphone market share, followed by BlackBerry's parent company, RIM, and that was just 3 years after Apple released its first iPhone ever.
Motorola were out of step with the market. They were flat-footed, they got too big, and at the same time, agile Asian competition, particularly coming from South Korea with Samsung and LG, just outpaced them.
Motorola eventually had to figure out how it was going to survive, and that's when it started to turn towards Google and Android, but that took time.
Still, Motorola found its mobile business successful enough to spin off into a separate company in 2011, creating Motorola Solutions and Motorola Mobility. Google swept in to purchase the newly separated Motorola Mobility for $12.5 billion in 2012.
Their business was losing money, they were losing lots of share, it wasn't strategic anymore, and eventually that resulted in the sale to Google, for whom people had high hopes.
This gave Google a team of smartphone experts and thousands of smartphone patents. This was a huge asset to Google, who was fighting with Apple over smartphone patents.
You had these massive companies who had mobile patent portfolios who were suing each other, doing cross-licensing. You had Microsoft, you had Apple, you had Google, among other, and you had companies like Motorola, who had built very large patent portfolios. And Google, who didn't have mobile patent portfolio, had nothing to defend with, had nothing to countersue with, had nothing to negotiate with.
Together, Google and Motorola focused on more affordable smartphones.
I remember when Google acquired Motorola Mobility. It seemed like a really good thing for most of us because it would allow, it seemed, Google to put Motorola Mobility back on the map with these really clean and fresh Android phones that could allow Google and Motorola Mobility to compete directly against Apple. In the end, that's not what actually happened. It sort of faltered, even though it launched some compelling handsets.
Motorola's North American market share for smartphones dropped from 6% to 3% during its time under Google, while Apple jumped from 46% to 53%.
It's very hard to take a hardware point of view, insert that into an advertising company, and have something good around it, even though Google was the birthplace of Android. I believe it set it back and actually put more distance between Motorola and companies like Apple.
Google sold Motorola Mobility in 2014 to Chinese computer company Lenovo for $2.9 billion, $9.6 billion less than what it paid for the company.
I think it said, hey, we're not making money off of this business, but we have the patents, so we can now defend ourselves with Android if Apple or anybody else wants to sue.
And Lenovo saw the value in Motorola Mobility.
The Lenovo branded smartphone business was doing okay in China, but wasn't really doing anywhere else. And Lenovo thought that bringing in the Motorola brand, they would do a lot better in the Americas and in Western Europe.
Today, Motorola still lags behind much of its competition. In Q3 of 2019, Lenovo, which includes Motorola Mobility, had a smartphone market share of 8%.
You know, we're now in a situation where we have a duopoly really of Samsung and Apple dominating the total market.
The past few years have been pretty boring for Motorola. It hasn't launched any flagships that compete with Apple's best or Samsung's best phones, but that's about to change.
Motorola recently revealed its new Razr folding smartphone, which impressed reviewers during the first look, but is not expected to make a huge splash in the market.
It was very hard for them to get attachment in the premium space up there with Samsung and Apple. So I think perception-wise, this is exactly what it needs.
in this kind of homogeneous sea of smartphone sameness where all the devices look the same, nothing jumps out. And that's where I believe that the Razr strategy is a good one.
It's really hard to imagine what the world would look like without Motorola's innovation. Radios, televisions, transmissions from space, cell phones, all of these would be very different today without Motorola. And Motorola Solutions, the company that produces radios for first responders, software for 911 dispatchers, and other non-consumer products, is flourishing. Solutions stock rose 332% from January 2011, the month and year Motorola Solutions and Mobility split, to November 2019. Lenovo, the current owner of Motorola Mobility, had an increase of just 14% in the same 8-year timeframe on the Hong Kong Stock Exchange.
In my time as a journalist, I've seen lots of brands go, and I haven't seen many brands come back. Motorola has been on the way out for years, and even if it does have a successful foldable phone or a really nice flagship next year, it needs a lot more than that to come back to the top.
I do think there is hope for Motorola to be a relevant vendor over the next 10 years.
Things are looking up for Motorola Mobility, but it might never reach its former glory.
Even if they could get to a point where they were able to secure a meaningful market share, start getting consumers to at least have some consideration for their products, which I think the Razr will help do, then that's the very, very early stages of a path to recovery.